Ladies and gentlemen, in a globalized economy, there is more than ever a compelling case for global, high-quality accounting standards. The European Union had come to this conclusion as early as in the 90s, when we were actively seeking to achieve the single market. Transparent, comparable, reliable financial reporting was viewed as one of the necessary building blocks for an efficient and integrated capital market. A second reason why comparability was so important was the fact that European companies wanting to gain access to capital markets outside Europe could not use their local financial statements. They had to provide additional information, which in most cases was based on the US GAAP. So it was thought that with a harmonized set of accounting standards, it would be possible to solve this problem as well. The EU had only a limited options to arrive at this harmonization as a single set of accounting standards. A first option would have been a full harmonization through EU directives. But this was deemed too difficult, too time-consuming. The views differed so much between member states. For some countries, the main purpose was to provide information to investors. In some countries, the main concern was the protection of creditors. In more countries, the main concern was the link with the determination of profit or loss for tax purposes. So this was too big a challenge to go through EU harmonization directives. A second option would have been to create an independent European standard setter, which would have provided a set of uniform rules. This was a quite logical option, but again, it was not practicable because there were so many differences, not only concerning the objectives of the harmonization, but also because of very different tradition, different institutional setting. A third option, adopting the US GAAP, was viewed as unacceptable because this was tantamount to outsourcing a part of the EU legislative power to the US Congress. So finally, the only realistic option was to opt for a standard setter which was truly international, truly independent, and which had already provided a set of high-quality standards, and this was the International Accounting Standards Board, the IASB, which had published already the IAS, International Accounting Standards, and later the IFRS, International Financing Reporting Standards. In 2002, the Council and the European Parliament adopted a regulation which obliged EU-listed companies to provide their financial statements on basis of the IFRS from the financial year 2005 onwards. As you know, the IASB is an autonomous private sector body, and this means that it was difficult just to adopt as such the standards published by the IASB. That's the reason why a so-called endorsement process was included in the regulation, and this means that it was necessary, before adopting the standards published by the IASB, it was necessary to check whether they meet the requirement of presenting a true and fair view, whether they are conducive to the European public good, and whether they meet the criteria of clarity, relevance, reliability, and comparability for financial information. And the task of checking whether these requirements and criteria were met was given to the Commission. The Commission decided to adopt or to reject a standard, but following the advice of EFRAG, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, and after a vote in the Accounting Regulatory Committee, which is made up of Member States' representatives. This choice of the European Union had positive effects in terms of the quality and comparability of financial reporting. Even critics of the IASB acknowledge the fact that adopting the IFRS was a real step forward. However, the financial crisis brought about a debate on what many experts considered as an excessive resorting to market value, especially for accounting for financial instruments. In particular, the establishment of immediate fair value when there is no market or for non-liquid assets is something very complex, very risky in terms of data reliability. And indeed, some critics argue that fair value accounting has significantly contributed to the financial crisis and certainly has exacerbated the severity for financial institutions. And therefore, this debate raised the awareness of economic stakeholders, but also of political decision makers, about the potential impact of accounting standards on listed companies and therefore on the economy as a whole. For example, in the Europeen Council, when the 2002 regulation was adopted almost without discussion, in the same Europeen Council, ministers began to raise questions about the European influence within the IASB. Notably, Minister Christine Lagarde was especially vocal in her critiques of IASB, an institution which she saw as intellectually dominated by a country which keeps its own national gap. So, in this context, where on one hand, the IASB continues to acknowledge the major influence of North American positions, even if it now seems clear that the United States have no intention to adopt the IFRS in a foreseeable future. On the other hand, the use of IFRS has spread to other regions in the world, notably Asia and Oceania, which legitimately ask for more influence within the IASB. So, in this context, the question was how the European Union, the main user of IFRS in terms of market capitalization, how the European Union could gain and maintain the leadership in standards development and adoption process. And the answer to this question must take into account the fact that, as it is too often the case in international organizations, the European influence is reduced because it is diffuse and fragmented. EFRAG, but also the national standard setters, the national and European supervisory authorities, the association of users and other stakeholders have different and sometimes opposite views about the proposal of the IASB, and they notify these quite divergent views to the IASB, which of course diminishes the influence of the European Union. And therefore, it was necessary to revisit the way in which these activities are organized to achieve a better coordination of the European positions in this field. Moreover, policy choice in the field of accounting involve public interest stakes that should be considered more thoroughly. By influencing the behavior of actors in the financial markets, they can have an impact on the stability of these markets. But EFRAG, which should be the natural Europe's voice in the accounting debate, EFRAG was perceived as a purely technical committee whose views did not always take appropriate account of these macroeconomic consequences. So, Commissioner Barnier asked me to respond to the question raised by the Ecofin Council, so I produced a report in October 2013, and given the broad support for this recommendation in the Ecofin Council, Commissioner Barnier asked me to supervise their implementation. The main recommendations deal with EFRAG. As I said, the European influence would be strengthened if the IASB could be sure that the position taken by EFRAG is a coordinated European view. The expression of different positions is quite beneficial in the early stage of the process. However, when the European position has to be expressed in an official comment to the EISB, there should be a single European voice. Therefore, it is necessary to have an institution whose composition and rules of functioning allow for the gradual achievement of a consensus, or at least for a European position supported by a large majority of stakeholders. The EFRAG Supervisory Board was not a true board when you come to substantive issues. The board did not approve, for example, the letter of comments to the EISB or the advice for endorsement to the Commission. Therefore, the main thrust of the reform was to transform EFRAG in such a way that it appears more representative and more legitimate. EFRAG's position today are adopted by a new board and no longer by a technical experts group. This new board approves the letters of comment to the EISB, the advice for endorsement to the Commission, and it must take into consideration broader economic consequences. For example, EFRAG is currently advising the Commission for endorsement of IFRS 9. It's clear that EFRAG must take into account the consequences that this new standard could have for the banking sector, including the long-term financial institution. So this new board is composed in such a way that it includes representatives of the main stakeholders. And for the decision of the board, the rule is the consensus. Only in exceptional circumstances, decision can be taken by a qualified majority of 2/3 of the members. And this search for consensus might be sometimes difficult, and it will be the main task of the President to do its best efforts to achieve consensus. But finally, a consensus position issued by this more representative EFRAG will have more weight within the IASB. So let me conclude by summarizing 4 points. First, a global uniform accounting system remains an ambitious but legitimate goal which can contribute to reducing the cost of capital in a globalized economy. Second, even if the US do not endorse the IFRS, we should continue to work with the IASB for developing high-quality accounting standards. Third, in order to be more influential in the elaboration of these standards, the Europeans should, as much as possible, should speak with one single voice. And fourth, to make this possible, the representativeness and legitimacy of EFRAG was strengthened along the lines recommended in my report. Thank you for your attention.